offensive, scandalous, blasphemous, even satanic. Christians couldn't believe what they thought they saw during the opening ceremony of the Olympics. Was that a drag show interpretation of the Last Supper? Was that Jesus at the table as the DJ of the party? Oh, those French. Is nothing sacred. Is nothing sacred anymore. Sorry, Etienne. I don't know if you heard about this, but these are the type of things that tend to show up in my Google search results because the internet has figured out apparently that I am a pastor. So I Google Olympics or opening ceremony instead of finding out when Simone Biles is performing or when the U.S. basketball team is playing South Sudan. I get Christians offended by the opening ceremony. So for those of you who haven't heard about this, you have those who say that this performance, one of many, was a portrayal of Da Vinci's Last Supper painting, and therefore a mockery of Christianity. Then you have those who are like, calm down. This was clearly not about that. This was the feast of the Greek god Dionysus. All right, so you have, as we do, two sides. Those, both of them, who think that the other side is stupid and ridiculous, right? Now, I could be wrong, but the most obvious parts of this performance were indeed about Dionysus, because this makes sense. Greek mythology and the Olympics go together. Additionally, Dionysus was the god of wine, and when we think about the French, we think about wine. At the same time, I don't think that it's crazy that someone could notice similarities to this in the Last Supper. They're both feasts. Plus, I understand. I really do understand why we get offended easily when it comes to things like politics and religion. Because these two things are often connected to identity. This is who we are. Are they making fun of me? Is this something against something that is really meaningful for me? Now, to be clear, even if this was about the Last Supper, I would not be offended at all. But the bigger question to start with for all of us is, how do we navigate life and faith and even politics in a world where people believe so many different things? And this is where I think the book of Daniel, which we've been looking at for a while, is so helpful because it reflects the experience of Jews who are trying to figure out how to navigate life and faith and even politics in a pluralistic world with all kinds of different beliefs and perspectives and behaviors. And what we've seen so far in Daniel, with Daniel and his friends, is that they're actually more chill than we are about a lot of these things, about a lot of these differences, especially as they relate to art and culture and literature and even religion. But in Daniel chapter 9, there is something that is offensive to Daniel, and it's related to the Greek god Zeus, who happens to be the father of Dionysus, which takes us back to the opening ceremony of the Olympics. Now, keep in mind that in chapter 8, Daniel was overwhelmed by this vision of his people suffering at the hands of empires for centuries. Then in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, he hears that the people of the ruler or the emperor will come to destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end. And then jumping ahead just a little bit, he will put an end to sacrifice and offerings. Other translations say he will banish worship and prayer. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation, scandal, blasphemy, satanic even. So all of this is a reference to the historical invasion of Jerusalem by the Greek emperor Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC. This emperor invaded, and as he did everywhere, he forced his own culture and religion upon those whom he conquered. And he did this in Jerusalem by outlawing Jewish religious practice and preventing them from worshiping in the temple by turning the temple into an altar to Zeus, the father of Dionysus. This is the abomination. This is the scandal. This is the offense. So what is it that Daniel is offended by here? First thing, he's offended by the violence that comes in the form of military invasion and all the suffering caused by war. That's clear. Secondly, he's offended by the forced denial of their right to practice their faith in their own homes and in their own places of worship. So as far as I can tell, nothing even close to this happened in the opening ceremony. Maybe you saw something that I didn't. I mean, except for there was the rock opera that had Marie Antoinette's beheaded, her head in her arms, and then blood red streamers shooting out from the castle as a reminder of the violent French Revolution. So there was that, but as we know, Americans tend not to be offended by violence. So I didn't get any articles about that. Daniel, however, is overwhelmed by the violence. So he does what most of us would do. He binge posts online about how offensive and scandalous and blasphemous this all is, right? Of course he didn't do that. Instead, he did something way weirder, much more unusual. He takes time to reflect upon his own faith and his own responsibility. So notice what happens starting in verse 2. I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures or from the Bible, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the devastation of Jerusalem would last 70 years, 7-0. But again, he's seen in this vision suffering that has lasted centuries. So I turned to the Lord to seek an answer. So I prayed to the Lord my God, and I confessed, Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, we have sinned and done wrong. I mean, think about how unusual this is. I mean, the violent and greedy empires are clearly the problem. They have the power. They're the one doing most of the destruction. And yet in this chapter, at least, Daniel is willing to consider the part that he and his party, if you will, had or played in all of this. So this week, I'm sure you've all seen many of these too, a number of interviews with politicians, some of whom were asked the question, what do you think the other side has gotten right? This is a question that sometimes comes up in debates. And as you might expect, the response is always interesting because at least this particular one was, well, they certainly didn't get this right when they did that, and they certainly didn't get it right when they did this, and ultimately the question goes unanswered. The same thing happens when they ask the question, is there anything you and your party could have done better? And we get answers like, well, we could keep improving on these successes that we've had, and we could keep improving on those successes that we've had. It's like answering the question in a job interview, what is your greatest weakness? And you're like, well, I work too hard, I care too much. Sometimes I get my work done too fast. I mean, it's really bad. So we can't control, obviously, many times what other people do, but we can be reflective and we can do what we can do or what we can control. So, not only is Daniel willing to consider his own responsibility, to recognize that maybe I could be wrong, but the suffering that he sees in this vision causes him to reevaluate his faith. And again, it's connected to his identity, his faith. He starts out reading the Bible in one way, specifically from Jeremiah, that Jeremiah meant 70 literal years would pass before the end of this suffering and exile. Now, Daniel could have said The Bible says it, I believe it, end of conversation. Instead, he allows his understanding of faith to be moved by the suffering of others. It's already been more than 70 years. So through prayer and reflection, he comes to a different conclusion. It's now 70 times 7, or 490 years. Now, I know that questioning our faith can seem scary. It is scary. But Daniel's changing perspective allows him to take more seriously the suffering of his people. Additionally, the number 490 in the Bible is less literal and more symbolic, pointing to a time of rest, pointing to a time of justice, pointing to a time of freedom that will come. So his changing faith becomes both more honest and more hopeful all at the same time. So again, I'm not offended by the opening ceremony of the Olympics. But let's pretend for a moment that I am. Those French. I cannot believe what they did. So perhaps in this moment of feeling uncomfortable and offended, I'm inspired. I came to church and I heard about Daniel chapter 9, and I begin to look for those who might be suffering and to reconsider what my faith means in light of the experience of those who are struggling. So keep in mind that this performance in the Olympics was taking place on a bridge with boats from nations from all over the world, all passing below. Athletes from Russia, athletes from Ukraine, athletes from Israel, athletes from Palestine, a delegation of refugees, likely displaced from their homes because of war and violence. They're all traveling down the same river, under the same bridge, invited to eat at this table, at this meal. And if the table, in this case, is the Lord's Supper, it's a meal that tells the story of Jesus' experience of violence. It's a meal that reminds us that human violence is forever foolish, that human violence is eternally unjust. It cannot give us what we ultimately want. I actually wish that the performance was about the Last Supper, because it would have made a lot of sense in that moment. Second, the performers were drag queens who statistically have a higher likelihood of experiencing violence and exclusion because of who they are. In fact, because of Christian outrage, those specific performers have received threats of violence. So, if the table was the Lord's table, it's a meal that tells the story of how frequently Jesus ate with those who were rejected and excluded and hated by those who were religious. Communion is this spiritual practice of inclusion, where all are welcome, especially those who are hurting and wounded. Which means that I really wish that it was about the Last Supper during the opening ceremony of the Olympics, because it would have been offensive only in the way that Jesus was regularly found to be offensive because of his wide and inclusive love. Now, since we are in an election year, there is a good chance, there is a high likelihood that at some point we will all be offended by something, probably on a regular basis. And in many cases, that offense will be justified. But is there room in all of this for our rage, or at least a portion of our rage, to be transformed into compassion? Is there room for our religious certainty to be transformed into love for those who are different than us? Anger certainly has its place. It's a normal human emotion. But the world really isn't short on people being angry and offended. So where is there room in all of this for our rage and our certainty to be transformed into compassion and love? Jesus, thank you for welcoming all of us to your table. As we eat together, help us to see each other. Help us to see our world with love and compassion. Amen.